How you feel is to a huge extent who you are. But how often do you pause to really consider, how are you feeling? And even if you ask the question, what answer do you get? Most of us have a very limited vocabulary, somewhere between 7 to 8 words to describe how we're feeling, and most of which aren't even emotions, but words to describe our physical state: tired, overwhelmed, busy. When our guest confronted his feelings following his father's death, he realized how limited his understanding was. As an academic, he decided he needed to find out more. His starting point was the honesty that he wasn't dealing with emotional intelligence, but emotional ignorance, which became the title of his wonderful new book. Tune in for a great conversation with Dean Burnett.
Hey folks, welcome to The Evolving Leader, a show born from the belief that we need deeper, more accountable, and more human leadership to confront our biggest challenges. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
How are you feeling today, Mr. Gomes?
Oh, a mixture of things. I am feeling really excited for this conversation because I really enjoyed the author's book, and just the person behind the book. I'm looking forward to getting to know, and I'm also anticipating a week in Florence next week for my holidays. So I need that. So, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling a breath of emotions today because it's been a pretty intense time. So I'm feeling a little bit fatigued, but I'm feeling also kind of playful and kind of excited because I'm very interested in our guest today as well, and all the things we're going to talk about. Because today we're joined by Dr. Dean Burnett. Dr. Burnett is a neuroscientist, lecturer, author, blogger, podcaster, pundit, science communicator, comedian, and numerous other things depending on who's asking and what they need from him. So previously employed as a psychiatry tutor and lecturer at the Cardiff University Centre for Medical Education, Dean is currently an honorary research associate at Cardiff Psychology School, as well as a visiting industry fellow at Birmingham City University. He is currently a full-time author, previously known for his satirical science column Brain Flapping at The Guardian, which ran from 2012 to 2018 with over 16 million views. And this led to his internationally acclaimed best-selling book, The Idiot Brain, which has sold hundreds of thousands of copies and been a bestseller in nations like Canada and Mexico. And his second book, The Happy Brain, was published in May 2018 with a similarly large readership as his first book. And his most recent book, which I'm particularly eager to speak with him about today, is called Emotional Ignorance. Dean, welcome to The Evolving Leader.
Oh, thank you for having me, Scott. John, lovely to be here, virtually.
Dean, welcome to The Evolving Leader. How are you feeling today?
I'm okay. So I currently work from, and I'm in my outside office in my garden. A lot of grass cutting going on because we've got a bit of spell of dry weather. So apparently the hay fever I had for like 3 months when I was 12 has come back in the last 2 hours, which makes for great recording. Excellent prospect. Sometimes you got to think you're being sabotaged by life, and just got to go with it. So if I sneeze randomly, that's what that is. Other than that, plowing on, all going good.
Okay, well, before we dive into your work and so on, let's imagine that we're in a dinner party. We don't know each other. We're not talking with people in your space. And I say, "Hi, Dean, what do you do?" What would you say?
Again, it depends on the dinner party, I suppose. Depends on the on the guest list. Depends who's interested. But I tend to say I'm an author now because that's the most accurate and the most simple thing to say because it is the truth and it's something people recognise. But if the conversation carried on and there was actually more interest, I would say I'm a neuroscientist and author or a neuroscience author, even though a lot of stuff I write does cover a wider remit. There's a lot of psychology in there, a lot of physiology, a lot of social psychology, sometimes sociology. It's all part of the same tapestry of brain-based matters. But I think one thing people don't really think about is that when you say you write about the brain, what it does, that does cover pretty much everything humans do and have ever done. So gives you a wide remit, so you can cover a lot of stuff. But neuroscience author is my general go-to for casual discussions, such as the one you've put to me.
When you're in this dinner party, let's just take it a little bit further. What's the most kind of unusual question you might get from somebody trying to figure out who you are?
Oh, yeah. I guess not unusual, but the question which people think is straightforward, but is very sort of unusual answer is like, how did you get into this? Or like, or how do I get into it if someone who wants to follow a similar path? And I cannot really give them a straightforward answer because this isn't something I planned to do. Like, I didn't sit down at age 20 and think, right, my 10-year plan, my 15-year plan is to move into this space and become a go-to person for this. It was very organic, but very sort of unintentional. I am not someone who comes from a traditional academic background. I was never immersed in that world growing up. So I was figuring out as I went along once I got into it, just by sheer interest. And ignorance was a big part of my success, I suppose. I didn't know I shouldn't be doing stuff, so I ended up doing it, and it sort of paid off because no one else had tried to do it.
How did you kind of find yourself in? I'm fascinated. Like, how did you come to get into this work accidentally?
Well, yeah, like I said, I was doing my PhD after various iterations of attempts at science jobs and qualifications and stuff. I got a PhD place, which I was very pleased about, because at first I thought I wouldn't do a PhD because I was first family member to do something as simple as A levels, let alone anything more. So I didn't know how far I could take it or how far I should take it. But I was always wary of that sort of cliche of the perpetual student, someone who never wants to get their hands dirty. So I thought, much as I'd like to do a PhD, I think I could do one that'll get an actual job between between then and PhD, but I didn't know if it would be a permanent thing. So I ended up looking for a science job, and I was based in Cardiff, so I ended up working embalming the cadavers for the medical school, which was, as far as getting your hands dirty goes, I think that ticks that box very, very thoroughly. So I ended up doing that, but then I wanted to do something different, because obviously I was becoming a bleak, morbid person, because he would. And that's when I finally took the plunge and tried some stand-up comedy, which I always wanted to try but never had the guts to do. But like I say to people, when you spend all day, every day handling dead bodies, your threshold for what you'll put up with changes drastically. So I thought, my big fear was I'll do a stand-up set and no one will laugh. But then I thought, well, if they're still breathing, that's a step up, really, for my day job. So I lost all fear of doing it, and I did it, and it went okay. And it became a sort of thing of mine. But then I realised I prefer writing the humour to actually delivering it. And I was like, I'd write a new set. I go, that's good. Oh, now I got to tell someone. And that was became a bit of an odd thing to be annoyed about. And but then I discovered blogging was a thing. Just the idea you could just write stuff and put it out there and maybe find an audience. So I started doing that. And I tried to combine science and humour, because that was something I was sort of two of my interests. So people said you should never combine. But again, I was very ignorant. I thought, well, why not? Is it a rule? Is it a law? Can you not do that? I'm going to have a go. Who's going to stop me? Why? It's totally consequence free. And I sort of started trying to do satirical science stuff, which found a bit of a niche audience, and then ended up writing a piece for The Guardian of a similar vein, and they picked up my work, and I became one of their most popular bloggers. And then an agent reached out and said, I like your work, the Black Guardian. Do you ever thought about writing a book? And I had, but in the same way that people think of owning a jetpack. That'd be nice. Not going to happen. It's just an idle daydream. But then it became a thing. So, I've quickly transpired I was much better at communicating neuroscience, talking about it, than actually doing it. Because, again, I didn't have the experience and the drive to be a sort of 100% focused researcher. But as a result of just trying new things and diversifying, I ended up in this very strange space I found myself in. But like I say, it wasn't planned. It was just taking advantage of opportunities my blundering around ended up providing me. So there we go. I mean, I'm not sure I can do it again, but I'm sure there are other routes into it, which other people should take.
I love it. So we really enjoyed, there's a lot to cover, but I'm going to jump into your new book, because we really enjoyed that. And it's not a usual tone of a neuroscientist, which our audience already has an appreciation for, just listening to your story of how you came to be a writer and get into your profession. So, and the subtitle gives us a particular clue around its unusual tone, which is Misadventures in the Science of Emotion. But it does start with the very sad loss of your father and your recognition that perhaps you weren't fully able to maybe understand completely what you were feeling. So can you take us to the origin story of this book and why you wrote it?
Yeah, I mean, it's much like my own career as a whole. It's a very sort of convoluted origin story. I did plan on writing a far more upbeat, straightforward book than I ended up producing. Came off the back of my book, The Happy Brain, like you mentioned earlier on, my second book, and I was doing the usual promotional tours and the events, and people come to me afterwards, and people liked the book. I would have no complaints about that. But one question I kept getting asked was, why do you write about happiness? Why not any other emotion? Which isn't as complimentary as they think it is. I mean, they're basically saying, why do you write this book? Why do you write a different book? Oh, glad you enjoyed it. Thanks for that. That's marvellous. But it happened often enough that I realised, there clearly is interest out there in emotions in the wider context, as emotions as a whole. So I thought what I could do, because I've been led to believe that emotions, science of emotions is a lot more established, a lot more, accepted than it really is. I thought what I could do, I'll just write a breezy, easily accessible book about emotions. I could do one chapter about fear, one chapter about anger, do funny asides about that, funny analogies, explain the neuroscience of it. 7 chapters or 8 chapters, however many emotions I can find. Job done. That's a perfectly acceptable book of my sort. And my publishers agreed, shook hands, signed the contracts more specifically, and went off to write it. And that's when I sort of sat there and realised, oh, actually, the science of emotions is far, far more complex and nebulous and hotly argued than I'd been led to believe. It was like just an area I hadn't delved into much. Because in main neuroscience, where I was delving into, like behavioural neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience, emotions are just sort of acknowledged but not really explored. It's just like, and then an emotional reaction occurs, and which led me to believe that they were, just, oh, that's well accepted. We all know that works. This is the important stuff over here. But it's not that. It's more like almost like a conspiracy of silence. Say, look, we know they're there. Don't know how they work. So let's just not look at them. And then everyone, we're all going to agree, yes, that we're just going to ignore those because that's too complicated. And that's what I ended up sort of having to delve into. And the more I researched it, trying to find the basic fundamentals. Like one of your former guests, Dr. Richard Firth-Godby here, I asked him about it. I said, I can't find a accepted definition of emotions. And he was laughing in my face at the audacity of even thinking I could find one when no one has so far. And no, but you can't even find the basic definitions, right? That a whole simple book isn't going to happen. So I explore different avenues, had to reformat the book several times, and then was on the verge of throwing in the towel, thinking I can't write this, I can't do what I promised to do. When the pandemic hit, and I thought, oh, I'm stuck home alone with everyone now, and I'm, can't do anything, can't do much, and everyone's up in the air, so I'll just keep plodding on with it. And then, like I say, I was well set up to ride out the pandemic. I'm a psychology, mental health go-to expert, and that was a big-ish area at the time. And I was already working from home before it was fashionable. And so I thought, oh, this is going to be okay for me. I'm going to be, set up appropriately. But then, my father contracted the virus early and passed away within a month. And it was completely unexpected. He wasn't even 60, and it was such a time of such uncertainty and isolation, all the usual mechanisms of coping with grief and things which help you work through it were denied to me because I was at home alone with my wife and 2 small children. And even then, I couldn't just let it out, which I know is the healthiest approach, but I have 2 small children who had no one else in the world right then and no access to anyone, and I had to sort of put on the brave face and suppress it as best I could to not traumatize my family, or all I've got at the moment, and end up sort of realizing that all I have at the moment is a head full of powerful emotions and a contract to write a book about emotions. So I thought, you know what, this seems like, for want of anything else to do, I should combine these things. I can use my own neurological insight, my experience, my knowledge to explore my own emotions, pin my own psyche to the corkboard and say, okay, why am I feeling this? What is this in my head? What is it? Why is it happening? What's the benefit of this in the evolutionary sense, in the sort of mental health sense, the well-being sense? Why do we go through all this powerful stuff when we lose someone? Because, it can be debilitating and last months. It seems counterproductive, but clearly it must happen for a reason. We don't just make this stuff up. And using that as the hook, is what sort of powered my whole journey through the world of emotions, trying to find answers from my own experiences. And I think at the end of it, I did sort of combat my emotional ignorance, which is what the book ended up being titled, because that was basically what I was trying to do. I'm ignorant about why I'm feeling this, why I'm going through this, as are many people. How do I tackle that? How do I address ignorance? And that is what the book ended up being.
And you start the book in ancient Greece and kind of show how the kind of thoughts from Plato and Aristotle and others kind of set the kind of way in which we look at it, and that mantle got passed down the generations through to Thomas Brown and Darwin and right up to almost present day, before people like Lisa Feldman Barrett and others kind of challenged it. Can you take us a little bit through kind of where that kind of origin story and how it manifests itself in modern thought?
Yeah, I want to clarify to the listeners, I didn't go to ancient Greece. It's like a metaphorical thing. If I had that ability, I would be writing about this. I'd be sort of thinking, by the way, I've got a time machine. So let's all focus on that, shall we? Because that's more of an achievement. But yeah, it's sort of like the ancient Greek Stoics, like where the name Stoicism comes from. They were, again, this is Dr. Richard Frith Godby pointed me in this direction, the first to accept emotions or acknowledge emotions as a concept with scientific validity, as in they were very, the whole meaning of Stoicism comes from them. They only thought things which had a tangible presence in the real world were worth studying, were actually, genuine, and things which were irrational or illogical or not real were to be avoided. And that's the whole school of that sort of Puritanism, that hyper-rationalism. Like they were like proto-Vulcans, but they acknowledged that emotions were real, tangible things, because they recognize that when you have an emotion, you have a physical response to it. Your face changes, your skin flushes, your body expresses things in a certain way. So clearly they have some sort of biological form and presence. And that was like the key observation which kicked off the whole study of emotions as a concept in their own right. I mean, they weren't called emotions then; they were called passions and things like that. And they said, but they sort of acknowledged that emotions were irrational, so they should be suppressed or ignored, and you want to achieve the state of apatheia, which is like completely independent of emotions and only obey rational thought. Sort of like a more scientific version of enlightenment, I suppose, like when you extinguish the self. Of course, with the ancient Greek society ended eventually, sadly, but these views and these values were incorporated into more religious ideologies which occurred at the time, especially proto-Christianity, like the whole idea of sex is bad and emotions are bad. This all, like, the Stoics believe sex should only be for procreation, because otherwise it's an emotional process which makes no sense logically. I mean, we don't think that now, but at the time, so it was incorporated into the more the Roman cultures and the later Christian cultures. So it became a persistent thing of like, you should always suppress your emotional desires, because that's, those are bad. But it became, mixed up with religious ideology, religious thought and stuff pretty much until like the 19th century Edinburgh lectures and the philosophers like Thomas Brown and so forth, who decided to like try to wrestle the mantle of emotional study away from the philosophers and the religious types and put it back into the realms of psychology and science, saying these are real things which happen in your brain. They're like thoughts, like senses, and emotions are a part of the human neurological makeup. Again, Charles Darwin did a whole book about the interaction between emotions and facial expressions. So, like, and Darwin himself obviously has a lot of influence. And the word emotions came from there, like this word to be applied to all these different, not conscious thoughts, but feelings, sensations we have in our own bodies and in our own minds. And so that sort of that's when like the scientists wrestled the control of emotions back from the more esoteric worlds. But there's still a lot of problems in that, because there's still no accepted definition of emotion which all scientists agree on. I think I found the one in the study which tried to combine all the different definitions into one, which made some sort of super definition, which is even more confusing. It's one of those definitions which, when you read it, you know less than when you started. So, like, I wasn't as confused before I read this as I am now. So it has the opposite effect. So that's still part of the ongoing thing. And we have the Paul Ekman, then Lisa Barrett, to ebbs and flows and like schools of thought. Currently, we're very much in fundamental emotions versus a constructivist viewpoint. This one argues that emotions are inbuilt. We have primary emotions, which all the emotions are formed from. We all have like 7 or 8 or 5 emotions, depends who you ask. Much like we have 5 fingers on each hand. We just happen to learn that. Whereas now there's more of a constructivist viewpoint that says, actually, no, what we have is affect, the raw building blocks of emotions, and they are constructed on the fly, in the moment, depending on what's happening. And our brain learns to do that over time. And that's why emotions are always refined and so slippery and so hard to pin down. And those are the sort of dominant schools of thought in the moment. And I'm sure there'll be others along eventually.
I'm supremely interested in where these different strands of thought in psychology are taking you, and where have they taken you? So, I do emotional intelligence coaching, and there's 2 things often missing from the conversation or even the framing around this idea of building emotional intelligence. One is creating the space for people to actually experience and feel their emotions, right? There's a lot of tendency to want to bypass it. But also what I find, almost completely omitted from the conversation is this idea of what are emotions for? Like, why do we have them? So where is your research and where has your study of these different vantage points, where's that landed you in your thinking?
I think my own sort of experiences sort of have been coloured a bit by the fact that, like you mentioned it, when I was working in the psychiatry program as a tutor lecturer, I inherited a lot of lectures from other people who had sort of taught the course before I got there and since moved on. One which is about emotions, which focused almost primarily on the primary emotions theory. We have inbuilt emotions. We all have the same ones, and they're expressed in various combinations. And so I thought that was I thought that was established. I thought that was everyone knew that was what it was. So discovering the more constructivist viewpoint made it sort of more intriguing. Like, find out, to be confronted with 2 separate arguments is one thing. To have become presented with one that you just take on trust, and then suddenly you're not, you're not confident with that anymore. It gives it a different slant. So I'm more interested in the constructivist viewpoint these days, and I do think this idea that your brain creates emotions on the fly as and when needed, it sounds counterintuitive to so many people because we all have such profound emotional experiences. We all recognize them. The fact they could all be created in the moment doesn't seem plausible, but it does reflect a lot of how the brain works generally. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that memories themselves are like constructed in the moment from the different memory traces scattered throughout your brain. Like, individual elements are saved, and the combination is recreated when you trigger those particular elements. And that's why memories are also constantly being updated and refined and tweaked over time. Or like your visual system, the fact that we have this rich, diverse vision is great, but it also, it comes from just like slow, muddy trickles of neural impulses from your retinas. So your brain is doing a lot of polishing, a lot of on the fly refining visual information, interpreting a great deal. So your senses are also, your brain going, let's create this here and now in the moment. So there is, a lot of stuff in the brain which works like that. And I do think there's more to that argument than people perhaps accept, because I think the primary emotions idea has been dominant for quite a while, and it has been, I will say, misused to a certain extent, perhaps not intentionally, but it's been taken on trust to the point where it's becoming a bit of an issue now. Like, there's so many corporations and companies which have this idea that you can recognize the basic emotions in your employees and respond accordingly, or it makes people seem too simple. Like, there's a lot of facial recognition software now which reads emotions, which isn't a thing you can really trust software to do. I mean, people struggle to do it well enough without context, without understanding the person. The idea that a machine can do it so you can read a customer's face, go, oh, they like this product because they are happy now, they don't like this product because they are sad now, is a massive oversimplification and a rather sort of unhelpful twisting of the actual science itself. Whether or not that science is completely valid is a whole other issue. And yeah, I do think there are many sort of oversimplifications of emotions in the wider world, particularly like the business and corporate world, because you hear people going to interviews and having like personality tests to say like, oh, you're an Myers-Briggs or something, or like you've got a you've got a fiery temperament, or you have to be controlled in this way. People just don't work like that. Emotions aren't that predictable or established. They are far more in flux, far more malleable and always changing, and that makes people as complex too. And I don't think that's really given enough credence as an idea. It just makes, I know it makes working harder, makes dealing with people harder, but that doesn't. The world doesn't exist to make things easy for you. This is just how we are.
I really love that definition that you have in the book of motivation being the cognitive energy that makes us want to perform certain actions and behaviors. Can we talk about how, because this is a huge topic, how emotions and motivation work together, particularly for Scott and his quest to avoid eating cookies?
It's not my quest. I like cookies.
No, you need to avoid. I'm telling you.
Well, shall I step out for a minute, guys? This seems like it might be a bit of a personal issue.
Scott's going to step aside and go and get. He's got a punch bag out the side as well.
Everyone should have one. All podcasters, for some reason. Well, emotions and motivations are heavily intertwined. I think, say in the book, they come from the same Latin word, mover, to move. So they both acknowledge as having this. There's also a sort of drive. They make us do things. They make us either do things or want to do things. And there are lots of different levels of motivation. There's the basic fundamental motivation, which comes from reflexes and instincts. You touch a hot stove, you are immediately motivated to move your hand away. It happens much faster than in the realm of conscious thought even. It's also all hypothalamic stuff. When something happens, body is compelled to go elsewhere. But because human brain is so massively complex and advanced and has so many layers of function, there's the basic instinct, there's the emotional aspects of like the sort of the more mammal limbic regions, and then we have the abstract thinking, the neocortex, the consciousness, the forward planning abilities. So because humans can simulate, humans can hypothesize, we can predict and work towards certain actions. So we are capable of things like delayed gratification. Like the cookie example, I think I use in the book, like as in, you may see a cookie or a cupcake or something which, that's very tasty, I want to eat that. And that is a basic motivation. It's a biological stimulus, because a biologically rewarding thing is presented to you. You want to consume and go get it and engage it. That is a motivation. But, that's sort of kind of low down, fundamental motivation. Whereas above that, you have long-term plans. Like, I'm training for a marathon. I want to be an athlete. I want to get in shape for summer for my beach body. Whatever your motivation is, that involves an abstract simulation of a potential outcome, your ideal self. So you have your current self, your ideal self, and between the two you have what people define as your ought self. So in order to turn my current self to my ideal self, I ought to do this, I ought to do that. A lot of that means turning down immediate rewards. I do want, the cookie, the cupcake, whatever it is, but I don't want to gain weight. I do want to look good on the beach, or again, whatever your impetus is. So I'm going to avoid that, even though my biological motivation is saying not to. And it's a constant sort of balance, yin and yang, between these warring emotions. I mean, it can happen on the same level too. Like the example I use in the book is delicious cupcake there. I want to go towards it. Delicious cupcake is on the other side of like a shark tank. I don't want to go to it. My self-preservation overrules immediate gratification with a treat. So, how
big's the shark?
It's hard to say. Water's murky. The bridge is rickety. So there's uncertainty as well, which throws things off. It could be a leopard shark. Could be like one of those like tiny ones. Could be like a great white. The uncertainty itself will also motivate you. But also curiosity can motivate you. Now you want to go there. I need to know what kind of shark this is because I'm a big fan of fish, and so on and so on. So there's all these different conflicting impulses. And like a lot of the brain is that. A lot of the brain is like multiple things happening, and one of them winning out. So like you have your executive function, like the frontal part of your brain, which is analysing all the things going on right now and saying, okay, what should I be doing right now? And it's something which you work on. It's something which you evolve and develop thanks to emotions. Like you have the emotional impulses and your brain needs time and practice to step in front of those, and not even step in front, just like rein them in, pull them back and say like, I want to do this emotionally, but I know I shouldn't rationally. And the two are constantly in flux, in sort of Just because sometimes the emotional reaction is the correct one. There's a lot of emotions are the precursors of thought in many senses. They are actually guiding even like the majority of our thinking, because conscious thought, objective analysis and rationalization is perhaps the most impressive, complex thing we can do. But it's a very demanding process. It takes up a lot of brain power to do that. So we can't do that for every single decision we make. You walk around the street, you can't stop and think objectively and rationally about every single thing that comes to you. Do I cross the road? Do I walk there? Do I look in this direction? Do I step over this? These are all things which happen subconsciously, which means your emotions are sort of guiding you more than anything else. And the conscious decision making is the most important stuff, the urgent stuff, the novel stuff, the uncertain stuff. So your emotions aren't guiding much of your thinking anyway, which means they are the ones which are making you do things. And when you have the ability to control them, or to regulate them better, you're more in control of yourself. And that's something which we learn usually during our teens, which teens are more prone to risky behaviors and sort of immediate gratification, because their brains have been updated, refined, matured, and the emotion systems mature faster because they are an older, more fundamental, meaning less complex, objectively, relatively, part of the brain. So your emotion system is online and hyped up when you're in your 13 or 14, but your more complex brain regions, which normally control and regulate your emotions, is still being worked on. It still needs to practice doing that. So when you're a teen, you are a bit more reckless, or a bit more sort of impulsive, and you feel things much more powerfully, and that motivates you to do behave in certain ways and do certain things which your adult older parents don't necessarily agree with, because they have a different emotional range. And therefore emotions and motivations have a huge overlap and there's a lot of interaction.
This whole thing around emotions and motivation is such a central experience to us, and I'm wondering why you were writing the book. Was there anything for you where you started to see your motivation change, or you understand it differently as a result of the kind of reflections you did writing the book?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's very much revamped and sort of overhauled my appreciation of emotions, my acknowledgement of them, because I had fallen into the trap that many scientists do, that emotions, if not bad, are things to be sort of suppressed or at least avoided. Because the scientific method with research, a lot of it is set up ostensibly to prevent emotions getting involved, because obviously there's lots of things about science people recognize, but it is still the work of humans, work of people, of individuals who will have emotions. So when you are expected to run an experiment for 3 years and your career depends on the outcome, can you say you'll be emotionally disinterested? You cannot. Even if you mean to be, it's very hard to completely shut that down. So much of the scientific method, like double-blinding procedures and peer reviews and stuff, it is all there to a certain or lesser or greater degree, prevent the emotions from interfering. I know scientific publications have to be non-emotional. They say, here are the facts. Here is the data we produced, here are the methods we used, here are conclusions based on these facts. You can't have emotions in science or in scientific procedures. But I think that's sometimes taken too far, the idea that scientists can't be emotional or aren't emotional, because they clearly are. I think I mentioned in the book, when you're a scientist in the modern world, you have to be very, very driven to conduct an experiment which may last 5 years, which takes all your time and effort and energy, and may produce a result which is useless to you, and chase the data, chase the grants, chase the research across the world. And if scientists are meant to be very, very smart people, that's the stereotype. I mean, I've met a few which would challenge it, but that doesn't matter. But it's that's the stereotype. But think of it completely logically, as scientists are meant to do. Apparently, it's meant to be very logical, rational people. Why would you do that? Why would you dedicate your life to something which may never happen, which may not make a difference, which involves you pursuing immense personal sacrifice, immense time sacrifice, makes family life hard, makes career progression hard, I know, which isn't essentially that financially rewarding. Why would you do all that if you were nothing but a logical person? You wouldn't. You'd pick a much easier job which you can apply your intellect to. Scientists become scientists because they're invested, because they are emotionally driven to do it. And it's an emotional factor. You won't have science without emotion. And yeah, I was very much in the old school camp of oh, if only we could suppress our emotions, if only we could shut them off and be like Mr. Spock, that would be much easier, and that's not the case at all. Like, I mean, they are a vital part of how we think, how we operate, how we function. And I have very much come around to acknowledging and appreciating that and sort of explaining that whenever any opportunity arises, because, it's such a common, it's very much an online thing as well. Like, well, I don't use emotions. I use logic and reason for my arguments. Like, you can't. It's not something people are capable of doing. You care about this. That's why you're getting involved with an online stranger at all. So, emotions are clearly a vital and unavoidable part of our thinking. And I think, the sooner we accept that, we'll probably get more done.
Talk to us about our tendency to think of emotions in a binary way, right? Sort of good emotions or positively felt emotions are good, negatively experienced emotions are bad. I mean, that's not the case, right? We tend to want to move away from negatively experienced emotions, but they're full of information, right? And usefulness to us. Can you talk to us about that sort of tendency and what you've learned about that and what we can do to be more open to the full breadth of our emotional experience?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's a particular sort of, I won't say bugbear, but it's a topic I go back to whenever I can, because I think it's one that is really important, as you bring up. And I mean, in the scientific sense, there are positive and negative emotions, like the valence of it. Is it negative? Is it positive? Does it make us feel better or make us feel worse? That's like the scientific classification of an emotional experience. But that's not to say that, these ones are bad, these ones are good. You're just saying how they make us feel. And there is a sort of, I wouldn't say obsession, perhaps the wrong word, but there is a sort of a tendency in the modern world, particularly in the world of social media and stuff, to really emphasize the positive, to the extent that the negative is often like seen as unhelpful or disruptive or harmful in some way. It's basically the whole toxic positivity movement, live, love, laugh and stuff. These are all, you can sort of, on the surface, these are all perfectly fine sentiments, it's nice, but there's a deeper process at work which is unhelpful. This idea that negative emotions must be avoided and you can choose to suppress them, and you should, is really unhealthy. It's really bad for well-being, because we have this full emotional range that our brains are capable of, and all of them are a vital part of our makeup. It is impossible to have a life where nothing bad ever happens. And even if it did, I would leave you a sort of an emotionally stunted person. Like, the analogy I always use is like going to the gym every day and only ever exercising your left leg. If you did that, for a couple of weeks, you have a nice big strong left leg, but the rest of your body would be all misshapen and lopsided, and you fall over and walk in circles, and that's unhelpful. You've done the work, but you haven't done the right work. Same as suppressing negative emotions isn't healthy. It's not good, and that's something else I explore in the book. Like, it's something else which changed my outlook, because I always used to be sort of like confused and sort of almost like laugh at the fact that people like and embrace art forms, creativity, entertainment, which induce negative emotions. Sad films and horror movies and angry music. These are all very, very popular formats. And on paper, they are types of expression and art and entertainment which induce negative emotions. So you should avoid them. But logically, people wouldn't like them. But that's not how it works. When someone makes you cry in a film, they win an Oscar. They make you laugh. They just get a pat on the head and told to go to Netflix. And that's a very, very different process. So clearly there is some sort of deeper meaning going on here. And I realized, one of the findings from the book is that when you indulge in these sad movies, sad films, for example, what you're doing is you're allowing yourself to experience sadness in a safe and controllable context. And that means your own sadness from your life. Your brain has a chance to process it, because the way the brain works, the system in the brain which processes emotional experiences, which integrates them into our system and allows us to deal with them and cope with them and file them away, is the same system which produces emotions. So you can't process emotions if you don't feel them. But what sad films and angry music does, it allows us to feel these emotions in a safe, controlled context, which doesn't cost us anything. So if you're watching a sad film, like, you're crying along with what's happening to the characters, but you can turn it off any time. It hasn't actually affected your life. You've just got the empathy. You've just got the vicarious sadness. So your brain's gone, sadness. Okay, cool. I can work with this, and I'm going to work through my own sadness and refine that and work through it and smooth that out and put it into my system. And that sort of makes you feel better. So like a lot of studies show that people who are heavy metal fans are counterintuitively among the least angry people by and large, because of their musical interests, their brains spend a lot of time being angry, but in the abstract. So when you allow yourself to get angry, but at no particular cause or source or reason, there's no sort of injustice, it's just a shared emotional experience, your brain spends a lot of time dealing with anger, so it's better at it. And therefore, when things do make you angry in the real world, like, you're not as quick to fly off the handle. You go, oh, I'm experiencing anger. I know what to do with this. And it lets you deal with it. I mean, you become a more emotionally healthy person. So yeah, there's, this idea that you have to downplay, suppress, or control, or otherwise just ignore negative emotions. It's an unhealthy one. And likewise, just emphasize nothing but the positives. That's also not how we should exist. And we haven't evolved to do that. And trying to do it is, it's on a high of nothing really in the long run.
Makes sense about all those furious ambient and chill out music fans.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of ambient music in the background, and I also a punch bag. So, do the math. It makes sense, doesn't it?
Can we talk about decision making? Because you have some very interesting observations there about the two-way street between cognition and emotions, and things around how color affects our decision making and so on. Can we talk a little bit about that as well? Because it ties into the scientific method thoughts that you had earlier on. Yeah, it comes back to the idea that you can have a purely rational, analytical, purely objective thought. You can, but those are like a lot more effort than people appreciate. A lot of it will be emotionally tinged. That's like it's an unavoidable part of your brain. Again, another thing I sort of changed my view on was this idea that in your brain you have emotions and you have rational thinking, rationality, if you want to give a shorter word. And that's, there's this binary, and they coexist side by side like two neighbours who share a fence. Don't necessarily get on. Maybe one neighbour's dog goes on the one's lawn a bit too often, and then they have a bit of a falling out. But separate entities in a shared space. But it's not like that. They are actually far more intertwined than most people realise. Even the parts of the brain which were supposed to be or believed to be this one separate, this one processes conscious thought, this one processes emotions. Those weren't nearly as clear cut as people thought when we got scanning technology advanced and we can look closer and deeper. Oh no, they are far more intertwined. So it might help to think of like conscious thought and emotional expression as like one river heading towards sea, and like a few miles from the shore it sort of splits. So like you get different outputs, different outcomes, but they have more in common, and they have a lot more shared background than perhaps we realise. So there is like a lot of emotional and conscious thinking overlapping, intertwined, but also that means that emotions is kind of like the bedrock of our analytical thinking, our understanding, and it can colour our thinking more often than we realise. Like, for example, colour. Technically speaking, different colours are just different wavelengths of photons hitting our retina. They shouldn't really have an emotional quality because it's just light hitting our eyeballs. What of it? But it does. A lot of the whole field of colour psychology, we associate certain colours with certain emotional qualities. Like red is always stimulating, to do with arousal, so it's either danger or excitement or sexy fun times or Father Christmas. That's a whole other. I don't want to attach him Let's
to
not
all
put
those,
all those things together. No.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's fan fiction nobody needs. And but it's like blues and greens are calming and reassuring. As again, you never see. You always see like blue and green and white and sort of lightly shaded colours of scrubs and gowns in hospitals. You never see someone in a bright red hospital gown, so unless the surgery has gone spectacularly wrong, but that's not planned. Because those colour, red and oranges, are stimulating, like they cause arousal, whereas blues and greens are reassuring, calming. And it does, it seems to evolve out of physical reactions to emotions. Green with envy, red with anger. These are biological responses we associate with. And like there's some evidence suggests that the human and primate colour vision is particularly attuned to recognise the colour changes in skin when people have an emotional reaction. So it could be that, it's not that colours make us see emotions, that emotions make us see colours, which is a sort of really strange roundabout way of looking at it. So again, even at that most fundamental level, emotions are affecting your thinking, your motivation, what you're focusing on. And you can't really think of anything unless you're being entirely abstract without taking these things into account. So it's really, really hard to separate emotions from decision-making processes. But because of the way conscious thinking works, it's always like after the effect. Emotions happen much faster than conscious thought, because conscious thought is a more complex process. Emotions are far more direct, or in, bang, out, whereas conscious thought is like A to B to C to D to E to F. So I think the analogy I use is that conscious thought is like the human, and emotions are like the big dog on a lead. Now the human's in charge of the dog, for all intents and purposes, but it doesn't technically control what the dog is thinking, what it wants to do, but it can restrain it. Like, if the dog wants to chase a squirrel, the human doesn't go in front and say, "Do not chase that squirrel." The dog goes, "Okay, I understand," because it doesn't. What it does, the dog just runs off, and you sort of pull it back and then try and stop it. Sometimes it's too powerful. Sometimes it runs off and it drags you with it, and then you have a mess to clear up. But but in most cases, it is like you don't control the emotions; you respond to them and rein them in, and sort of deal with their aftermath. You don't sort of preempt them, because you can't, because the brain, the conscious thinking process of the brain don't have that speed. They don't have the ability to do that, because emotions just happen too rapidly.
You briefly mentioned memory earlier in the conversation. I'd like to come back to that and talk about the interplay between cognition and emotions in memory. What role do our emotions play in our ability to encode and recall events? And how do we use that knowledge to have better recall?
Yeah, I mean, emotions are perhaps the most important thing when it comes to what we remember. I think to understand why that is, we have to appreciate that your memory system in your brain evolved a long time ago, before conscious thought, the ability to abstract processing and rationalization and simulation. Memory predates that, obviously, because, memory predates that because most creatures have a memory. Even the simplest ones, back in the old dinosaur times, they had memory. They had the ability to remember things, because creatures need that to exist and survive. But when you're a primitive creature, like sort of observing the world around you, how do you know what's important, what's worth remembering? Because you can't remember everything. No brain has that sort of capacity to meticulously encode every single thing we experience on every waking moment. How do you prioritize what to remember, what not to? But when you're a primitive creature, or like an older style creature, what causes emotional reaction? What scares you? What did you find pleasant? What made you feel disgusted? What angered you? These are things which are worth remembering in the primitive brain. And that is still, by and large, the system we're using. We've got like the abstract thought and reasoning systems bolted on top, which are very integrated. But our memory system still primarily prioritizes emotional experiences. Like, if you think of memories being formed like a big system of conveyor belts, just like items going in constantly, the ones which are emotions, like they're sort of tagged as like VIP or delicate, fragile, or priority. They get put on the faster conveyor belt, they go in, and they are like kept separate and safe from the others. So emotional experiences are, by and large, what our memory system reverts to when it seems to prioritize memories. Which is why, like, when you are studying for an exam or preparing a big presentation, which you need to have all this information to hand, it can be an arduous process, because even though you consciously, rationally know this information is important for my long-term plans, for the outcome of my exam, presentation, whatever it is, your memory system doesn't see it that way. You say that, but this is just abstract information. This is numbers, graphs, dates, figures, items, like equations. I don't care about that. This stuff doesn't elicit an emotional reaction unless you're really, really, really into it, which some people are, and that's why you get people with, enthusiasms and passions who can reel off stats at the moment's notice. But for most people, like, this is abstract information. It doesn't have an emotional quality, so you have to read it and reread it and read it again and again and again to give you more long-winded memory systems, like the repetition, the formation of memories gradually, to give that a chance to work on it and get into the system. So, and even then, when you've sort of done your exam and done your presentation, unless it's something you have to come back to on a regular basis, you probably will forget about it. I studied for months to pass my A-level chemistry exam. Couldn't tell you much of what's in it now, but I know it was all in there at the time. I passed, but then a month later I was like, oh yeah, that, it pops up occasionally. Because I haven't needed it since. And the brain just goes, oh, well, that's not needed. I'll just flush that with the rest of them. And that's, kind of annoying when it happens. But, think of an emotional experience, like, in school, like the exam example, you spend months trying to learn for exams, you barely remember it and then forget it afterwards. But if you're in like the school hall and your trousers fall down, exposed in your novelty underpants, and everyone laughs at you, that memory is not going anywhere. That memory is going to be with you for the rest of your life, and it'll just pop up when you're walking down the street like 40 years later. And you collapse into a ball and start cringing inside out because it's powerfully emotional. And that's sort of, your brain goes, oh, well, that must be important. Let's just bring it up again, time and time again, for no reason whatsoever, just to make sure you don't forget it. And that's why these emotional memories don't fade so much. They because they're emotional, because the brain thinks emotional equals important when it comes to memory.
How do we make this work for us? Like how do we...
Well, it's a lot of studies show that if you can attach some sort of emotional significance to the information you need, it's a lot more easier to take in. I mean, particularly with children. They've done a study quite some time ago now where, I think I mentioned the book, but they had sort of maths information delivered by two characters. One was Elmo from Sesame Street, of course, the beloved Elmo. One was some sort of bird character from Thailand. And these are like American students, American children who had never seen this character before. But the things like Elmo taught them, they were able to learn far more rapidly than the other character. But then, different group of students were given time to interact with this Taiwanese character. I think it was Taiwan or Thailand. I can't remember. I think it was Taiwanese, yeah. So like they given merchandise and watch the cartoons and play the games with it, and they grew to love this character. Try the test again. Now this character is as good as Elmo teaching them stuff. So if you have an emotional connection if you can induce emotional connection to the information, people take it in a lot better. That's why you get celebrity endorsements. If someone comes up to you and says, buy this bag, well, no, I don't want to. I don't care. Who are you? That's something which happens. But if famous glamour celebrity says, here's my bag, do you want it? People go, oh yes. Like, it sells through the roof because people have an emotional attachment to this individual, and the information they've imparted is more convincing, more persuasive, because there's an emotional element attached. And, it doesn't have to be sort of just a person doing it. People remember a lot more readily, take information a lot more readily if it's something they want to be doing, which is where the whole extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation comes in. If you let people discover their own enthusiasms, if they let them do things because they want to do them, they tend to be far more able to retain information, more dedicated to it, more willing to do it, than if you sort of reward them externally. So, again, the example I use in the book is doctors. People, why do you want to be a doctor? One says, I want to help people. I want to be a useful person. I want to improve lives. Someone else says, well, it's a good career. I need the money. It's a guaranteed job for life. The first person is intrinsically motivated. They want to improve lives. They want to, it's more personal investment in this career. The second person wants money and wants, security, which is totally valid as a motivational and reason, totally logical. But that's extrinsic. It means that if suddenly society changed and medics weren't as rewarded anymore, they probably wouldn't keep doing it because the rewards they have are dependent on someone else giving it to them. Whereas an intrinsic motivation, which is far more emotionally rewarding, because you want to do it, you find this stimulating, you find this engaging, and that when it comes to information, that tends to make you far better able to remember it too. Like if you have a favorite football team, I get this a lot. That people say, "Oh, you're a neuroscientist. That's amazing. I can never do that," and then they will reel off 70 years worth of stats about the Arsenal football team or the Green Bay Packers or whatever it is, because they care about that. They are emotionally invested in that. They have access to just as much information as I do, but they think it's not as impressive as what I do because that's brains and neuroscience aren't a mainstream thing. but they clearly have the capacity and ability to retain vast amounts of information because information that they care about. And that's sometimes all that makes the difference.
You being a stand-up and you write a lot of funny, witty things in the book. I was just chuckling away about your description of your feet. One of the things you wrote about.
It's just an observation, that one.
No, but it made me laugh. Probably because I've got similar flat feet. But the question really was about what have you learned about humour? What's it solving for from an emotional perspective?
Yeah, humour's a really intriguing one because it's one of those things, like I mentioned just now, like if you make people laugh in a film, it's not really that rewarded. Well, it's not as respected, perhaps, but it is just as impressive a feat, I think, as making someone cry with a performance. Not just like stealing their sweets and running off. That's just it's not impressive. We shouldn't reward that. It's one of those things because it's so commonplace. People don't appreciate how complex and sort of sophisticated it is, and it's something very fundamentally human. I think I've been married for nearly 20 years now. I've never been on a dating app, but I don't know if it's still the same. But when I was a lad, when I was growing up, every dating profile, every sort of personal ad, always said GSOH, good sense of humour. That's almost like the first and most fundamental thing you need in your partner, your romantic partner, no matter who they are, no matter who you're interested in. That's expected. That's the norm. So humour is sort of very intrinsically linked to human mating, human interaction. There's a lot more subtlety and nuance in there. And it's also a very powerful thing, I find. It shows how incredibly complex and impressive the human brain is, that you can, with a certain combination of simple words delivered in a certain way, you can make someone laugh hysterically. And so you've just used some very basic, bodily functions to induce an extremely powerful emotional reaction in someone else, or in many people. If you're the one in the front, like if you're doing comedy, you're doing a good job of it, you can say some words and the entire room just falls about laughing. That's an impressive feat when it comes to interaction and emotional, and it's very rewarding because we're such empathetic, such social creatures. But in a sense, it is the sort of human equivalent of like a deer's antlers. It's like the idea that we have this massive brain, which is such a biologically demanding construct. It absorbs most of our body's sugars and oxygen, despite taking up 2% of the body weight, because it's a hugely demanding construct. That we would use that to tell dad jokes or puns. It seems like just squandering it, but that is that's the whole point of things like deer's antlers, peacock's tails. It's like, I am so successful, I have such access to resources, I can afford to just waste them frivolously. Look at these massive antlers. Don't even need them. Never use them. If I get my head stuck in a bush, I'm dead. I'm there for the foreseeable. But I've got them because I am just so fit and healthy. And humour is sort of a human equivalent of that. Yes, I've got this massive brain. No, what I'm going to do? I'm going to manipulate words to make you laugh because you know what? Why not? But it's not just that. It's a social bonding thing. Like people are 30 times more likely to laugh in a group than alone. It's a release of psychological tension. That's one of the arguments, in that something bad happens, something incongruous happens. Your expectations are violated, whether it's through words or visual situations or slapstick is a good example. Someone slips on a banana, falls on their back, and then technically, that's bad. They could be seriously hurt. If they slip and go, ow, it's okay. So I was tense. Something bad could have happened. It didn't happen. Now I will laugh, and we can all acknowledge the fun of it all. And then there's also the status thing too. Like you laugh at someone, you are superior to them. If you make them laugh, you are superior to them. If you're the butt of a joke, you are inferior. There's all these different aspects of the human psyche are sort of enhanced or manipulated or just take part in humour and exploit it in some way. So yeah, it's a really, really fundamentally important thing for humans, at least.
I know we're near the end of our time here, but I've got one more question I'm curious to get your insights on is how does your understanding of emotions, how can that help us to navigate the new technologies that are shaping the world?
Yeah, so I think it's something I mentioned earlier on, that technology and emotion aren't as compatible as people seem to think in many cases. I mean, there's lots of different applications of technology which try to, I don't say manipulate, but I think try to sort of induce an emotional reaction or try to factor in an emotional reaction from people. And it tends to backfire, because one thing humans are is very, very good at detecting emotions and recognizing emotions in others. We expect it. We are very empathetic creatures. We have empathy. It's a hugely complex process which allows us to detect emotions of others via a myriad of complex but subtle cues. And our brains expect that. So when we're talking to someone, we'll see in the face, tone, posture, gestures, even sort of like stance, and like all these different cues that are given off, which we sort of subconsciously recognize as emotional information. And that allows face-to-face communication to be the most enriching, most sort of stimulating type of stuff we crave. We could, especially post-pandemic, we could have all just stuck with Zoom calls and just staying in our own house just to keep things safe. But we didn't. As soon as we got that opportunity, straight back out, straight in front of me, because that's what we need as humans. We want that. And technology tries to mimic that, and it does a bad job, because if one thing humans don't like, it's artifice when it comes to emotions. We do not like being emotionally manipulated. We don't like being deceived. Example I always use is if you've ever had to use a train in Britain, it will have been delayed, because they always are. I mean, it's literally like there's no other option at the moment. But when that happens, you get the announcement over the station speakers, and it'll say, "I'm sorry to announce that the 10:45 train to London Paddington is delayed by approximately 17 minutes. I am extremely sorry for the delay to this train." And then I guess they play that as a sort of to keep you calm, but it has the opposite effect. People are going, "I know, not only is my train late, but I'm being lied to by a machine. Like, that machine is not sorry that my train, it doesn't know. It's got no conscious thought. It's just like, you're not sorry. Stop saying you're sorry." It's like when people do false apologies, we do actually have a sort of a very low threshold for putting up with that. That's why, actors who are good have to be really good. Bad acting is something which is really grating, because when someone tries to display an emotional reaction, it's like, no, that's wrong. We have a very high threshold for that, so low threshold for putting up with that. And technology obviously has this problem. It doesn't have emotions. It just tries to mimic the signs of it, but they're so complex, so subtle, and so sort of nuanced, and it's something we have evolved to do that software cannot do yet. Again, AI images are probably the good example of this. It's very common to see AI art. Even though there's they're all wildly different, they all have this same quality, this sort of glossiness, this aspect which we can go, "Oh, that's AI." Even if it is sort of seamless, I've got like 53 fingers, or it's not like it's upside down on a roof. Like, it's even then you could tell, like the whole uncanny valley thing. Something is too close to being human, but not quite. It doesn't have the right emotional expression. So, but on the other hand, someone gifted artist with a ballpoint pen can draw a picture which will go, "Oh, that's amazing." Even if it's simple and crude, we just have a strong emotional reaction to it. So, humans are able to convey emotions, and machines don't have them, so they can't. And I think that's something which has been overlooked a lot. This expectation that we'll just ignore it. We won't. It's an issue which I think needs more looking into.
To close, can you think about a takeaway for leaders that you would like to see them consider, adopt, or challenge themselves in what you've come to understand around emotions?
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between having control and authority and being a leader. The latter is probably a lot to do with emotions, because when you have control, you have authority, what the people you're in charge of feel or think doesn't really matter. You don't have to have their involvement, their investment in you. This is just the situation. So you're in charge, you're in control, but I wouldn't say that makes you a leader. If you can engage them on an emotional level, if you make people emotionally relate to you, that makes you a leader. I think you may not be a good leader, you may make them do bad things, but that is, I think, the difference between being a boss, being like a manager, being in charge, and being an actual leader. People, if you're a good leader, people want to do what you say, want to follow your instructions, because they're emotionally invested in you and believe in you on an emotional level, and that, I think, is the difference. And to do that, you have to sort of acknowledge that people under you have emotions, they have emotional needs, emotional drives, and trying to sculpt their emotions to what you want is usually a counterproductive process. The whole like Happy Fridays and sort of this idea of constant employee happiness. Some people just aren't happy. Some people don't have this happy demeanor. Accepting that rather than trying to change it is probably a better strategy for for good long-term leadership, in my humble opinion.
What a wonderful, succinct way of putting a definition around leadership and emotions. I love that.
Thank you. I'm glad you liked.
Dean, thank you so much for sharing some of your wisdom and insights. And it's been a delightful conversation, and I could talk to you for hours more, but sadly we're not allowed. So we're going to wrap it up. And folks, do get your copy of Emotional Ignorance. Everybody needs a book that says Emotional Ignorance on their shelf. It'll be a great conversation starter. And now you'll...
I agree.
Yes. John's holding it up right now. If you're watching the visual. Yeah. Do it. And remember, folks, until next time, the world is evolving. Are you?